If you follow me on my work, you know that I shoot with a whole bunch of different cameras. More recently, I've been shooting a lot with the Nikon Z6III and also the Nikon ZF. But for my entire professional career, I've been primarily a Sony shooter. And so I have the most experience shooting with Sony cameras. And although I never talk about them on the channel, it is mostly how I make my living. So my day job is a wedding photographer and videographer. And for the last 3 years, I've been shooting with the Sony A7IV. And I've always been a Sony shooter. I started with the Sony A6000. I shot with the Sony A7R II, then graduated over to the A7 III. So I have a ton of experience shooting with Sony cameras in a professional setting.
My life was a puzzle scattered across a coffee table. From the second you walked in, you fit those pieces together, one by one, with infinite patience and impressive ease.
Rachel, you are the most incredible person I've ever met. Loving you is so easy. It's the greatest thing that I've ever felt, truly, in every way. You're just fundamentally the greatest person. And everyone here who's experienced that loves you. Unequivocally loves you.
For the last 6 or so years, this collection of faces and souls is the essence of their relationship, because as we all know, Andrew and Rachel's love was born and nurtured in community. If I found myself to be a brilliant star, 1,000,000 light years from this earth, would you promise to find me? So I will take my sacred vow to be your memory, to be your protective thorns, and to be your moon. I would come back 1,000,000 more times just to love you.
After 3 years of using the Sony A7IV professionally for weddings, I can confidently say that it's Sony's best all-around camera for photo and video. And coming into 2025 with like the looming release of a new Sony camera, especially the successor to the Sony A7IV, it seems like Sony has so many different cameras in all different price points. Like they have a cinema line for videographers, they have high resolution stuff for photographers who require high resolution cameras. So why is it that after all this time, I'm still using the Sony A7IV. I've been shooting with Sony A series cameras for a very long time, like I said. And what I do appreciate about the cameras is that they don't change very much in terms of design. So the cameras have always been very familiar to me. And if you're familiar with this channel, I complain a lot about how I don't really enjoy shooting with these cameras for fun. But as workhorse cameras and as cameras that primarily make me money, knowing your camera very well goes a long way, and it's a camera that I know like the back of my hand. I can shoot with this camera all day long and not ever have to look at the buttons or the placing of things because I know it like the back of my hand. Like what I do appreciate about Sony cameras is the fact that you can customize the heck out of them. Before with the Sony A7R II, which I started with, the menus are really funky and I really didn't enjoy customizing that camera. But for the Sony A7IV, it was the first time I ever kind of jumped the gun and pre-ordered a camera because it kind of had the stuff that I was looking for. And this camera is so well balanced to me in terms of specs. Like if I want to shoot photo, it's a 33 megapixel sensor, which to me is more than enough. If I want to crop, and which I kind of tend to do, if I want to recompose a little bit, the image doesn't degrade very much if I'm not doing major cropping, as well as all the video features that I really like. Going from 8-bit video in the Sony A7 III to going to 10-bit video in the A7 IV, it went a long way and it really pushed the boundaries of what I could do with video. Because for me, having a camera that's super versatile for work, it helps me capture moments a lot better. For me as a wedding videographer, I think it is super important to stay in the moment and not to make my couples feel like they're performing or like the event is like content for my channel or for my business. So I want them to enjoy their wedding days, and shooting with cameras, they're like kind of very, I feel like they're very disarming. They don't look Like, I'm not shooting around with a Sony FX6 or a giant Canon camera. I know there's a lot of clients that kind of are drawn to that, but to me, I want to stay out of the way and make sure that my clients enjoy their wedding. So for me, showing up with a camera like this, people don't tend to look at me as much as if I was shooting with a bigger camera. When this camera was released, it was about $2,500. Now, 3 years later, it's already pushing down. You can get these marked down. I think right now you can get it for like $2,000 brand new. But if you want to get this on the used market, you can find these a lot cheaper. And so I think for a lot of photographers or videographers who are kind of looking to get into wedding videography or photography, and you're already shooting Sony, I think this is a great value of a camera if you're already invested into the ecosystem. With all the choices that Sony has for everybody, any kind of shooter, photographers and videographers, I think it's really hard to wrap their heads around what kind of camera they need, especially if you are someone like me who is a hybrid shooter. I know if you're a photographer and you're a Sony shooter, getting a higher resolution camera is very tempting. Or if you're a videographer, shooting with the Sony FX3 or now the FX30, which is a very good video camera, you get pushed towards that. But also if you're someone who is an enthusiast and you kind of want the same sensor as a Sony A7IV, the Sony A7C II exists, which is a great camera, and I owned it for a little bit last year. And for a videographer and a photographer, it really didn't make sense to kind of add that to the kit because I already had two A7IVs on my wedding for my wedding kit. So for me, this camera has the benefits of a lot of those cameras wrapped into one, because I think, especially now in 2024 going to 2025, a lot of people that shoot photos also shoot videos now, or who shoot video want to get some photos at the same time. And for a professional setting, to me, having a camera that you can write to two dual cards at the same time, it goes a long way for redundancy. If you're familiar with my channel, you know that I added some Nikon cameras to the kit. Well, I love the Nikon Z6III. Not being able to shoot video to both cards, it is a little bit daunting to me because as someone who does live events, I've never had a card go corrupt on me, which I'm really grateful for. So I'm still gonna stick to Sony for my primary cameras. So having a camera that you can write to both cards is a lot more useful than people realize, especially because some Sony cameras you can only write to one card. It only has one card slot. So to me, for anybody that's looking to be in the professional setting, having something like that, having dual SD cards is pretty important. The Sony A7IV, even 3 years later, has amazing autofocus. Everything I shoot for in my channel here, like my talking head, this is being shot with the Sony A7IV. So it's autofocus that I can really trust in a fast-paced setting, especially live events, like a bride and groom walking down the aisle. I know that I can trust it. I don't really have to think about it because I have everything set up the way I like it. A lot of brands are catching up to Sony within the autofocus department. I think the Nikon Z6III has very good autofocus. I've used Canon cameras. I never liked the autofocus that I got from especially older Canon cameras. Fujifilm cameras, while I love them for stills, I could never trust them for video, so I never really used them for video. I know they're making leaps and bounds. They're leaps and bounds better than they used to be, so I'm excited to see what Fujifilm does in the future. But for now, Sony is kind of like on a league on its own. I know their autofocus gets smarter and better with every iteration of Sony cameras, but if you're in the market to get into like the system and you don't have like a huge budget, the Sony A7IV has a lot of those same autofocus features, and I think it's fast enough if you're doing live event work. Battery life is also very good in this camera. My wife and I shoot together in most days, so we share batteries. We have, I think, 7 or 8 batteries, and if we're shooting photography, just photos, we tend to go through like 2.5 each. If we're shooting video, you tend to go through more batteries, maybe 3.5 more batteries. But for me, I bring a charger just in case, but I never need to go into it. So for me, battery life is great on this camera. Another reason I really like shooting with the Sony A7IV, especially for live event work like weddings, is the ISO performance. Like for me, in my personal work, I don't get bothered by different ISOs. Like I shoot with high ISOs all the time. 12,800 ISO, even on like smaller cameras. It doesn't really bother me all that much, especially with AI denoise plugins for like Lightroom. But for me, for video, this was the first time that I was able to trust the camera to do well with its dual ISO performance. shooting in ISO 800 during the day and then shooting all the way to like 12,800 at night, it was a game changer, especially for me who does live events. Like for example, I do like speeches if I'm shooting speeches at a wedding, but other than that, I don't like to light people's faces because I don't want it to feel like a production. I want it to just feel like a raw live event. So for me, being able to shoot just in high ISOs in low light situations, it goes a heck of a long way for me, especially just to stay in the moment. Like once the party starts and I'm just shooting like dancing or people having a good time, it's important for me to be able to shoot in those ISO conditions. So the ISO performance in the Sony A7IV is very good, and it's something that I can trust a lot during hectic wedding days. And to me, the biggest reason I still stick to the Sony A7IV even after all these years is just how reliable it is. And it's not something I have to think about on wedding days. It's not something that, like, having to trust my camera is not something I have to like really ever think about. It just works. If you're following me on my channel, I'm always telling people that I shoot with certain cameras because of the way they make me feel. And for my personal projects, that is entirely true. But professional work, I want the cameras to get out of the way as much as possible. And online, you hear a lot about how, you want a camera that has some personality to it. And I do agree with that 100%. But for me, whenever I'm shooting events, I don't really need my camera to have a personality. I need it to do the work well and for me to be able to do the creative stuff. So for me, the Sony A7IV, even going to 2025, is a great deal of a camera, especially if you're already in the Sony ecosystem. So if you're a professional coming up APS-C cameras and you're already invested in some lenses, I think going with the Sony A7IV is kind of a no-brainer. You get a lot of the features you get with higher-end cameras without sacrificing a whole bunch and also staying within a reasonable budget. The thing that bothers me the most about the Sony A7IV is the screen and the EVF. To me, that's the worst shooting experience about this camera. Just having to look at the EVF with pretty low resolution and not super color accurate. The screen is a little bit better, but for me, as someone who shoots photos and videos, I would like a better EVF from the Sony A7IV, and which is one of the biggest reasons why I'm always complaining about the Sony A7IV is just that EVF is not very good, especially testing out different EVFs. Either like they're better color accurate, they're higher resolution, they're a little bit sharper. The Nikon Z6III's EVF is amazing. So to me, if I was jumping from the Sony A7IV to like eventually the Sony A7V, if it has a higher resolution EVF, I think to me that's the biggest reason to upgrade. Other than that, I think it's a fantastic camera. 4K 60 crop, it doesn't really bother me. So to me, if you can find one of these cameras around like $1,500, $1,700, it's an amazing deal, especially if you're looking to go from being a hobbyist to being a professional. The Sony A7IV has everything you need. If you've been following my channel, you know that I've been testing out the Nikon Z6III, and while I think it's a fantastic camera, I wouldn't recommend everybody to jump off of Sony and go into Nikon because things can get really, really expensive. But I mean, if you're curious about what Nikon has to offer, it has great offerings already. So I think if you're already heavily invested in Sony, you have all the different accessories, not just lenses and flashes. I think just if you're upgrading, I think the Sony A7IV is a fantastic offer. The Nikon Z6III is also another fantastic camera. So it really depends on what you're looking for. To me, shooting with the Sony A7IV for the last 3 years has made my business really flourish, and it made my job a lot easier. When I'm adding new cameras to the kit, it's all about diversifying and about adding different things that I could use for my wedding. So it's not about jumping systems, it's just more about options. Already, I think the Sony A7IV is a great deal, especially in the used market. But now that the Sony A7V is eventually going to be coming out, I'm assuming it's coming out in 2025 at some point, I think the Sony A7IV already is a great deal. So even if the next one gets announced later next year, picking up this camera is a no-brainer. I think you still get a lot of the features that you would need for professional work, and you're saving a little bit of money, which you can invest for lenses. So thank you so much for watching this week's video. If you have any questions on the Sony A7IV, anything in particular, please leave in the comment section below. And if you're not subscribed already, please subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you next time.